and welcome to Meeple University's How to Play Subatomic, an atom building game. Subatomic is a deck building game in which players will be using elementary and subatomic particle cards in order to try to build up atoms to claim elements from the elements board in order to gain victory points. The game ends after one player has claimed his or her fifth element card, and the player with the highest number of victory points wins the game. At the time that we filmed this video, Subatomic had been successfully funded on Kickstarter, but a hard copy of the game has not yet been released. So we'll be teaching the game from the official print and play version released with the Kickstarter project. As a result, any unprintable components that you'll see in this video have been borrowed from other games. Before I take you through how to play the game, I'll give you a very quick little science lesson, because without understanding what the concepts in this game mean, you're just playing an abstract game. So it's a little more fun if you know the science. That's right, science is fun. This is a molecule, and much of the universe is made up of molecules. A molecule is made up of atoms which are joined together in a certain order. So let's look more closely at the atoms. An atom is constructed roughly like this. In the center of an atom, there is a large heavy nucleus with a positive charge, and orbiting around the nucleus are some small negatively charged electrons. Now let's look more closely at the nucleus. Although here the nucleus is one big ball, in reality a nucleus is made up of lots of smaller balls all fused together into one big ball. These smaller balls are protons and neutrons. And the protons are positively charged, which gives the nucleus that charge. Can it get any smaller? Yes, it can. Each of these little balls is made up of 3 even smaller balls glued together. This is what a proton looks like. It is formed from 3 quarks or quarks of different types. And a neutron is also formed from 3 quarks. In this game, you will start with a handful of lowly quarks. You will then fuse them together to form protons and neutrons, as well as electrons, which you will fuse together to form your atoms. And it is the atoms which you will be claiming from the board for victory points. To set up the game, take the game board and put it in the middle of the table. Take the Annihilation marker and place it on the space corresponding to the number of players in the game. Take the 5 bonus tokens, shuffle them up, and place one on each of these 5 end goal spaces. Put the energy tokens near the board. Next, you'll need to take the subatomic particle cards and separate them into 2 packs. The single subatomic particle cards and the larger subatomic particle cards. These can be distinguished by this symbol being in the corner of the larger cards. Shuffle them into separate packs and then deal out 4 cards face up in each row. If you have 3 matching cards or more in any row, discard them and redraw. Next, take 4 of the 7 packs of scientist cards. These will be 3 cards matching a single scientist, and stack them in ascending order of energy score in the bottom corner. Do this with 4 scientists. Finally, shuffle up the elements pack, place it here on the main board, and deal 3 cards face up. The main board is now set up. Then each player takes a player board, 10 cubes in his or her colour, which is indicated by the chalk, 3 markers for building up atoms on this board, and a starting hand of 11 cards, comprising 4 down quarks, 4 up quarks, and 3 photon gamma rays. Shuffle these together, maintain a draw deck, a discard pile which has no cards in it yet, and draw a starting hand of 5 cards. Choose a first player who takes this token, and you're ready to play. Subatomic plays like most deck building games. The player will have access to the 5 cards in his or her hand in order to play and take actions. Additionally, a player may have energy tokens that have been collected on previous rounds. Energy tokens can be built up and then spent in one go on a subsequent turn. During a player's turn, he or she will play cards either face up or face down in order to gain their effects on the board. And there are a number of actions which I'll go through shortly. At the end of the turn, the player discards all played cards, but may keep any unplayed cards in hand. This is distinct from a lot of deck builders where the entire hand is always discarded. Either way, draw back up to 5 cards at the end of your turn, keeping any energy that you've gained. And if your draw deck runs out while doing this, like so, shuffle your discard pile and then continue drawing from that. Next, I'll talk about all of the actions that are available. All of the actions are printed on this area of your player board, and I won't go through all of these now because I'm going to go through them in a different order to how they're shown here, but I'll come back and revise them from here at the end of this section. Firstly, there are 2 free actions which a player may take on his or her turn, condition depending. If a player has 3 or more identical cards in his or her hand, he or she may announce that and discard one to draw the next card from his or her deck. Then, if all of the cards in one of these 3 rows are identical, the player may choose to freely sweep them out and replace them with new cards before shuffling the swept cards back into the corresponding deck. Next, I'll talk about the card actions. The first and simplest card action is that a player may play any card from his or her hand face down to gain 1 energy marker. A player may do this as many times on his or her turn as he or she wishes. The next action that a player can take is to buy subatomic cards from the main board. The cost of a subatomic card is shown at the bottom of the card and is added to the energy cost shown at the top of that card's column. The benefit of the card is shown at the top of the card. This row of cards has a lower cost but a lower benefit, and this row of cards has a higher cost and higher benefit. One important thing to note is that where you see 2 items printed at the top of a card, if they are shown inside an oval, you get the total benefit. This card is 2 protons plus 2 neutrons. Where they are not shown in an oval, it is either or. So this card is 2 neutrons or 2 energy. So in order to buy this card, the player would need to play 2 up quarks and 1 down quark face up into his or her play area. And return 2 energy tokens to the bank. You may play cards from your hand face down to get the energy tokens you need if necessary. Then take the card from the board and place it on top of your discard pile. Do not immediately refill the space left by the card that you've purchased. This will be refilled at the end of your turn. When buying cards from the top row, this is done using your starting cards, the quarks and the photons, and the cost of each card is shown at the bottom. So you can spend 2 up quarks and a down quark, as well as the required energy, in order to take this proton card. When buying cards from the bottom row, these are generally purchased using cards from the top row, protons and neutrons, as well as energy. So you could spend these 2 neutrons, as well as the energy on the card and the energy from the column, to buy this neutrons and energy card. In addition, instead of spending top row cards, you can spend combinations of starter cards if they add up to the same component. So instead of one of the neutron cards, you could spend 2 down quarks and an up quark, which represents a neutron, in order to take that same card. However, what you are restricted from doing is buying cards using cards from the same row. So you could not spend a proton card, plus the energy, to take this proton. And similarly, you could not spend the 2 protons and 2 neutrons cards from this bottom row, as well as energy, to buy one of these mega cards. Note that for this specific card, this 2 energy with the arrows on it is not a cost to buy the card, it's a cost to play the card. This is a particularly powerful card, and so you have to spend 2 energy in order to play it face up every time it comes through your deck. The next option at a player's disposal is to buy a scientist card. There are 4 decks of 3 scientist cards in the game, and each of them has an energy cost, which ascends by 1 energy for each subsequent card. So the card is cheaper when you buy it earlier in the game. This energy cost is not modified by anything else on the main board. So to buy this top Niels Bohr card would cost 6 energy tokens, which you return to the bank. You then take the scientist card, and as you would with the subatomic cards, place it into your discard pile. This will then later cycle through your deck and come up into your hand. When the card comes into your hand, you will be able to play it to gain the action which is printed on the card. The next option that a player has is to play cards to directly build up the atom on his or her player board. And ultimately this is what a player needs to build up in order to claim elements from the main board. In order to do this, play a card face up into the play area and move up 1 on the relevant part of the atom. You've got 3 markers which can represent the protons, neutrons and electrons. So the player could play a proton card face up and would add 1 proton to the atom. The player could play this card, which represents a proton, a neutron or an electron, and would choose one of these 3 to raise by 1 step. They might take an electron or may raise the proton by a further step. Players may also spend combinations of quarks or the 2 photon gamma rays required to make an electron in order to do this step. So the player could spend 2 down quarks and an up quark into the play area to gain a neutron on the atom, rather than buying a neutron from the main board. Remember that you have a key up the top of your player board which tells you how to form a proton, neutron or electrons from starting cards, from quarks and photon gamma rays. One restriction to remember when playing larger subatomic particles is that you cannot split the effect of the card across 2 different actions. For example, you couldn't place 1 neutron into your atom, then claim an element card, then come back and place the other neutron. If you don't use all of the effect at once, the rest of the effect is lost. Once a player has built up his or her atom such that it has at least as many protons, neutrons and electrons as shown on one of the element cards on the main board, the player may claim that element. In order to claim the element, the player must spend the amount of energy shown above that element. So in this case, the player could spend 3 energy to claim this beryllium card. The player takes the card, confirms that he or she has enough protons, neutrons and electrons, and then returns all of these tokens back to the top left corner. This occurs even if the player has more particles in the atom than are required. The player will lose all those particles. The number of victory points that a card is worth is equal to the mass number shown in the bottom corner here. Next, once the player has claimed an element, he or she places 2 goal markers, which are the cubes in his or her colour, onto different end goals on the board, with the restriction being that a player cannot place a cube into the end goal of the element that was just completed. So in this case, the player could place goals in any of the 5 goals except for beryllium. Players will be attempting to get majorities of cubes in these end goals in order to gain more victory points at the end of the game, and we'll see how that works later. Once a player has placed these cubes, if there are tiles left over in the spaces that the cubes were placed, the player may take one of those tiles. So in this case, the player could take one of these 2 tiles, but not both. Each of these tiles gives a bonus, which can be spent either immediately or later in the game. There are 3 other actions that a player can take by spending energy, not cards. A player may spend 1 energy to sweep out any one of these 3 rows of cards, not the scientists, and replace them with new cards. The old cards are then shuffled into the relevant pack. Secondly, a player may spend 2 energy to draw another card into his or her hand. Finally, a player may spend the amount of energy corresponding to the current space that this black cube is on to annihilate 2 cards. This means to take 2 cards from his or her hand and remove them entirely from the game. This allows the player to get low value cards out of his or her hand as the higher value cards start to build up. After annihilating, move this cube 1 space to the right, and as the game goes on, annihilating will become more expensive. So, to revise all of those actions that are available to you, you can play particle cards to slowly build up your atom. If you have an atom which has been sufficiently highly built up, you can pay energy to claim an element card from the board and place your goal markers. You can spend cards and energy to buy deck building cards and place them into your deck. This includes particles and scientists. You can play cards face down into your play area to claim 1 energy token for each of those cards. You can spend 1 energy to sweep any one of the card rows on the main board and refill it. You can spend 2 energy to draw a new card from your deck, or you can spend the number of energy on the Annihilation track to take 2 cards from your hand and remove them entirely from the game. Finally, and not written on the main board, if you've got 3 identical cards in your hand, you can discard one of them to draw another one for free. At the end of the player's turn, slide down any cards from high energy spaces to low energy spaces in these rows and refill the cards. This way cards will get less expensive the longer they stay on the board. Do this in the subatomic cards and the element cards. Then discard any cards that were played during the round. Hold on to any cards that you did not play and wish to hang on to, and then draw back up to 5, as described before. If your draw deck runs out, shuffle your discard pile, turn it into your new deck, and continue to draw from there. Once a player has claimed his or her 5th element card, he or she will place his or her final goal marker. This triggers the end of the game, and play continues around until the last player, which you can remember by the first player having this token. In this way, everyone will have the same number of turns. Then proceed to end game scoring. Finally, each player counts up his or her final score. As a starting point, add up the mass number on all element cards collected. So in this case, it adds up to 39. Next, evaluate each of the 5 end goals, and these are evaluated as follows. For the player who has the most cubes on a given space, that player will gain the top number of victory points for each element matching that type. So, On the helium goal, the pink player would gain 4 points for each helium card collected. The white player would gain 2 for each helium card collected, and the orange player would gain nothing. There are no further victory points for 3rd place, 4th place, or a player with no cubes on that space. In the event of a tie, the points for the tied positions are shared rounded down. And so in this case here, where white and orange are tied for 2nd place, the 1 point would be shared rounded down between them, which rounds down to 0, so neither of those players would get bonus points. So evaluating the white player's position, white would get 2 bonus points for each helium. White would get 3 bonus points for each lithium, but has no lithium. As we saw before, white would get no bonus points for beryllium, being equal 2nd there. White would get 2 bonus points for each boron. And finally, the element set gives these bonuses 1 for each element, regardless of its type. So the white player in 2nd place would get 1 point for each element card. The sum of all those bonuses was 13, giving the player 52 victory points. Finally, if the player has taken this bonus token from the goal areas during the game, it will give an additional 2 points. And so white's final score would be 54. All players total up their scores in this manner, and the player with the highest score wins. And that's how to play Subatomic, an atom building game. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you enjoyed playing, and I hope you enjoyed learning about science in the context of a board game. Please subscribe to our channel if you'd like to hear more from Meeple University.